The air conditioning in my father's car was always set to a temperature that felt like a rebuke. It was a cold, sterile air that smelled of new leather and his expensive, oud-scented cologne. As we drove, the chaotic, vibrant symphony of Lagos began to fade behind us. The blaring horns of okadas, the shouts of street vendors, the relentless thrum of a city that never sleeps. It was being replaced by the monotonous hum of the engine and the heavy, oppressive silence of Chief Adebayo, my father. I watched the familiar landmarks of Victoria Island blur past the tinted window, my reflection a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the world I was leaving behind. I realize now, he wasn't just driving me out of the city. He was driving me out of his sight. This final car ride was the culmination of 1,000 smaller cuts, a lifetime of them. I was the family's great hope, the one who inherited his sharp mind but possessed a modern ambition he could boast about at the Ikoyi Club. He'd parade me at galas, his hand on my shoulder, a silent testament to his legacy. "My daughter, Amara," he would say, his voice booming with pride. "She is building the future of agriculture." He loved the idea of me, the brilliant daughter, the innovator, but he was terrified of the reality of it, the risk, the potential for failure, the possibility of a stain on the immaculate fabric of his reputation. When my startup, AgriGen, collapsed, it wasn't a quiet failure. It was a public spectacle, a feast for the Lagos rumor mill. The whispers followed me everywhere. From the grocery store to the society weddings I was forced to attend, they were like mosquitoes, a persistent whining sound just at the edge of my hearing. What I didn't understand then was that my failure wasn't the problem. My public failure was. For my father, a man whose honor was his currency, shame was a debt he could not bear. The days following the collapse were a slow, creeping horror. My father didn't rage. He was a man of quiet, devastating pronouncements. He'd walk into a room and the temperature would drop. He spoke of honor, of family, of respectability. He never once asked what happened with my company. He never asked about the market manipulation I suspected, the sudden, inexplicable moves by a competitor that had squeezed my funding dry. My pain was an inconvenience, his shame was a crisis. The solution, he decided, was not to help me rebuild, but to bury the rubble. The final betrayal came not with a scream, but with a quiet, administrative cruelty delivered over a glass of Chapman in his study. The room was dark, filled with the heavy mahogany furniture and the weight of his expectations. "I have arranged a marriage for you, Amara," he said, not looking at me, but at the portrait of his own father that hung on the wall. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. "His name is David. He is a farmer, a good, simple man from a respectable family in the provinces. A farmer." The word was a judgment, a sentence. My mind reeled, searching for an argument, a defense. But I saw the look in his eyes. It was done. My mother, who was present, remained silent. She just smoothed the fabric of her wrapper, her knuckles white. Her silence was her complicity, her way of keeping the peace as she always had. In that quiet, I heard everything I needed to. I was being erased. "A simple man," my father continued, his voice laced with a tone of magnanimous authority, as if he were granting me a great favor. "His family is not of our stature, of course, but they are honorable. He will give you a quiet life, a respectable life. It is where you will learn humility." Humility. The word was a slap. He was stripping me of my career, my connections, my very identity, and calling it a lesson. He wasn't saving my honor, he was salvaging his own. My collapsed startup was the tangible legacy of my ambition, and he was burying it. And me, in the red earth of a rural province. The car finally pulled off the paved highway onto a long, unpaved road. The red dust billowed up behind us, coating the gleaming black paint of the Mercedes. It felt symbolic, like the dust of this new life was already trying to cover up the gloss of my old one. We arrived at a modest, single-story farmhouse. It was clean, well-kept, with a wide veranda and a tin roof that shimmered in the afternoon sun. It was the physical manifestation of the word simple, My father's driver unloaded my suitcases onto the porch. My father himself did not get out of the car. He simply rolled down his window, his face a mask of stern finality. "Behave yourself, Amara," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And then the car was gone, leaving me alone in a cloud of settling dust. I stood there on that porch for a long time, the silence of the countryside pressing in on me. The emotional dam had broken, but it didn't result in tears. It was something worse. Stillness. My pulse wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. A cold, heavy calm had settled deep in my bones. I was a ghost, haunting the ruins of my own life. I looked at the simple house, the symbol of my exile, and made a conscious, quiet decision. I wouldn't fight. I wouldn't scream. I would endure. I would become as small and as quiet as they wanted me to be. I picked up my suitcase, its weight a familiar burden. The hinges of the front door groaned as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of earth and wood smoke. It was the smell of obscurity. Let them think I'm broken. The first few weeks on the farm were a study in isolation. The silence was a physical presence, broken only by the chirping of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. My husband, David, was as unassuming as my father had promised. He was a quiet man, with kind eyes and hands that were calloused and capable. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his life, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. He would leave before dawn and return after dusk, his clothes smelling of the rich, dark earth. He spoke little, and I, in my self-imposed exile, spoke even less. Our conversations were a sparse collection of practicalities. Dinner is on the stove. The rains are coming early this year. My days were a blank canvas. I, who had once managed a team of 20, whose schedule had been a dizzying whirlwind of investor meetings and product demos, now had nothing to do but watch the clouds drift across the vast open sky. The shame and hurt were a constant, low-grade fever. I would find myself staring into the middle distance, my jaw aching from clenching it for hours on end. I was mourning the woman I had been, the one who lived and breathed technology, the one who believed she could change the world. Why did I let this happen? The question echoed in the suffocating quiet. But my mind, restless and sharp, could not stay dormant for long. It was my curiosity that saved me. It began with small things. I noticed that the farm, for all its rustic appearance, was unnervingly efficient. The fields were irrigated not by hand, but by a network of pipes that seemed to deliver water with precise, measured timing, even on the hottest days. There were no pests, no blighted crops, a near impossibility for a farm of this size operating without a massive labor force. My pain began to morph into a plan, an investigation, and the first step was to simply open my eyes. The first receipt was a drone. I saw it one afternoon, a sleek, black shape hovering silently over a distant field before zipping away with incredible speed. It was not a commercial, off-the-shelf model. It was custom-built, aerodynamic. Its design focused on stability in high winds. I knew the design because I had sketched something similar in one of my own notebooks, a fantasy of what agricultural surveillance could be. I felt a jolt, a flicker of my old self. I started walking the property, my long, aimless strolls now having a purpose. I was gathering my evidence. Tucked away at the edge of a maize field, half hidden by overgrown grass, I found a small metallic object sticking out of the ground. I dug it out with my bare hands, the dirt cool against my skin. It was a soil sensor, but like nothing I had ever seen before. It was self-powered, with a proprietary casing I recognized from a single grainy photo in an obscure industry journal. It was a prototype from Terraform Global, the world's most innovative and elusive agritech firm. They were legends, ghosts in the machine of modern agriculture, their technology years ahead of everyone else. The receipts began to pile up. The automated irrigation system I discovered was linked to the soil sensors, creating a closed-loop system that fed real-time data to a central server, conserving water with ruthless efficiency. The seeds David planted weren't from a local supplier. Their bags were marked with a simple, cryptic alphanumeric code that I traced after a week of late-night searching on a painfully slow satellite internet connection, back to a patent registered to Terraform. While I was quietly assembling my case, my father was performing his victory lap in Lagos. My mother would call, her voice full of forced cheerfulness, and tell me about the galas and the board meetings. Chief Adebayo was thriving, his reputation not just restored but enhanced. He was now the noble patriarch who had managed a difficult family matter with grace and wisdom, securing an honorable life for his problematic daughter. He was basking in the stolen glory of my submission, believing he had won. The contrast between his loud public performance of lies and my quiet, focused work of uncovering the truth was a whetstone, sharpening my resolve. My internal monologue had transformed. The hurt was still a part of me, a deep foundational wound, but it was now fuel. My thoughts shifted from, why did they do this to me, to, what is the truth of this place? I wasn't just angry at my father anymore. I was mourning the version of myself who had been so easily convinced of her own incompetence. I had let him write my story, and I had almost believed it. The smoking gun, the final, undeniable piece of evidence, came from David himself. I had gathered enough receipts to build a case, and I needed to present it. I waited for him one evening on the veranda, my heart a tight, frantic drum against my ribs. I laid out my findings, my voice low and steady. I told him about the drone, the sensors, the irrigation system. I told him I knew this was Terraform technology. He listened, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at me, his kind eyes holding a depth I had never seen before. "You are correct, Amara," he said, his voice calm. "This is a Terraform global research and development outpost." My breath caught in my throat. "My name," he continued, "is David Alabi. I am the founder and CEO of Terraform." The world tilted on its axis. My pulse wasn't racing. It was something worse. Stillness. A profound, world-altering stillness. David Alabi, the reclusive genius. The man who had turned down cover stories in Forbes and Wired. The architect of the technology I had only dreamed of. And then he delivered the final, damning piece of proof. The one that exposed my father's intent beyond any doubt. "I know about your company, AgriGen," he said softly. "I followed its development. You didn't fail because you were incompetent. You were targeted. A competitor, backed by foreign capital, engaged in market manipulation to acquire your intellectual property for pennies on the dollar after your funding dried up. It was a hostile, predatory act." He knew. He had known all along. "Your father came to me," David explained. "He wanted to form an alliance with my family, whom he believed to be simple but honorable. He offered me his problematic daughter. He never bothered to ask what I did for a living. He just saw a farmer, a quiet place to hide you. I agreed because I knew who you were. I saw an opportunity to bring one of the most brilliant minds in our field into my organization." There it was. The entire ugly truth. My father hadn't just been ignorant. He had been willfully blind. The narrative of my failure was more useful to him than the truth of my betrayal. I looked at David Alabi, this quiet, unassuming genius, and for the first time in months I felt a sense of calm resolve. The plan, which had been forming in the shadows of my mind, was now crystal clear. An alliance had been formed. It was never about my failure. It was about his honor. And now the whole world will learn the price of it. 6 months later, I was back in Lagos, a city that felt like a lifetime away. The air was thick with the familiar sense of petrol and roasting plantains. But I was breathing differently now. I was a ghost no longer. I was a weapon, waiting. The setting for the reckoning was perfect. A stage of my father's own making. The Echo Hotel Convention Center was glittering. A sea of Lagos high society dressed in their finest silks and starched agbatas. It was the Industrialist of the Year Awards, the most prestigious event on the business calendar. And tonight, the guest of honor, the man being celebrated for his decades of integrity and success, was my father, Chief Adebayo. My arrival changed the atmosphere, just as I knew it would. I walked in on the arm of my husband, David Alabi. To the room, he was still the simple farmer, a curiosity, a symbol of my father's magnanimity in handling his disgraced daughter. I was dressed not for a fight, but for business. A sleek, midnight blue gown, my hair styled in a severe, elegant chignon. My demeanor was calm, poised, and utterly unreadable. I saw the whispers start, the curious glances. My father, holding court near the stage, saw us and gave a tight, satisfied nod. I was playing my part perfectly. The repentant daughter returned to the fold, an accessory to his restored image. A pressure built behind my eyes, but I held it at bay. This was not the time for emotion. We took our seats at the family table, front and center. I could feel my father's pride radiating from him like heat. He was at the peak of his performative power. We let him have it. We let him bask in the applause as he was introduced. We let him take the stage and begin his speech. This was the bait. "Legacy," my father began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "It is the foundation upon which we build our lives, our families, our nation." He spoke of loyalty, of integrity, of the hard work and sacrifice required to maintain one's honor in a changing world. Each hypocritical word was a nail in his own coffin. I remained silent, my hands resting in my lap, letting him expose himself to the world. He spoke of the importance of family, of guiding one's children onto the path of respectability. He even glanced at me, a flicker of pity and pride in his eyes. The room, filled with the enablers who had accepted his narrative, nodded along in solemn agreement. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. He returned to his seat, his face glowing with self-satisfaction. The evening's host then returned to the podium. "And now," the host announced, "it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker. He is a man who needs no introduction, largely because he has refused every attempt at one. A true titan of innovation, a ghost in the machine of global agriculture. Please welcome the founder and CEO of Terraform Global." A confused murmur rippled through the room. Who was it? The name had been a closely guarded secret. And then, my husband, David Alabi, stood up from our table. He walked towards the stage. The murmur in the room died, replaced by a wave of stunned collective shock. I watched my father's face. The smile froze, then slowly dissolved. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from David to me and back again. The quiet farmer, the humble son-in-law. It was impossible. David reached the podium. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence in the room was absolute. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and steady. "My father-in-law, Chief Adebayo, speaks of legacy. It is a worthy topic." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But a legacy built on reputation alone is a house built on sand. A true legacy is built on truth, on innovation, on empowering the next generation to build a future we can only imagine." His delivery was factual, emotionless, and devastating. "Tonight, I want to talk about the future of African technology," he continued. "That future does not belong to my generation. It belongs to the innovators who are taking the risks, who are pushing the boundaries. Innovators like Amara Adebayo." He said my name, my full name. He turned and looked directly at me. A spotlight found me at the table. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. My pulse was a slow, heavy drum. "Many of you," David said, his gaze sweeping the room, "wrote off Amara after the collapse of her first venture, AgriGen. You accepted a simple story of failure. You did not look deeper. You did not know that her brilliant work was not defeated but deliberately sabotaged by predatory foreign interests. You did not know that her proprietary algorithms for drone-based crop analysis were the most advanced on the continent. He laid out the evidence of my brilliance, piece by piece, for the entire Lagos business elite to witness. Then, he presented the smoking gun. Terraform Global does not invest in companies, he said, his voice ringing with quiet power. We invest in people, which is why, tonight, I am announcing the launch of a new multi-million-dollar innovation fund. The Terraform Fund for African Innovation will be dedicated to identifying and scaling the continent's most promising agritech startups. He paused again, his eyes finding mine. This fund will be co-chaired by myself, and by my esteemed partner, the brilliant mind who will guide its vision, my wife, Amara Adebayo Alibi. The room fell into a dead, shocked silence. The sound of a glass dropping somewhere in the back was like a gunshot. I stood up, my movements fluid and deliberate, and walked to the stage to stand beside my husband. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces, the architects of my social exile. And then I looked at my father. His face was a ruin, his carefully constructed world shattered around him. He had been exposed, not by accusations, but by the undeniable public proof of his own actions. I didn't need to say a word. My presence on that stage was my closing statement. You can build your version of the story, but you cannot build it on top of my name. We stood there for a moment, a new power couple forged in the fire of his making, and then we walked away, leaving the chaos and the wreckage of his honor in our wake. Victory is not a lightning strike. It is the slow, dawning light after a storm. The immediate aftermath of the awards ceremony was a quiet, messy affair, a landscape of shattered reputations and hastily realigned allegiances. Walking through the reception hall after David's speech was like wading through the wreckage. The splinters of my father's carefully curated image were everywhere. The usual boisterous backslapping and loud congratulations that followed these events were gone. Instead, there were hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when my father approached. I watched him from across the room, a man suddenly isolated, adrift in a sea of his own making. The averted eyes, the polite but hasty retreats, these were the echoes of the truth David had unleashed. My father's currency, his honor, had been declared counterfeit. He was no longer Chief Adebayo, the titan of industry. He was just a man who had tried to hide his daughter and had, instead, exposed his own folly to the world. The enabler's confession, or rather, the antagonist's reckoning, came sooner than I expected. He found me near the exit, where David and I were accepting quiet, stunned congratulations from a few brave souls. My father approached us, his movements stiff and uncertain. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his expensive agbada seeming to hang off his frame. He tried to speak to David first, the man he had dismissed as an insignificant farmer. Mr. Alibi, he began, his voice hoarse. I was not aware. I know, David replied, his voice devoid of triumph. It was a simple statement of fact, which made it all the more devastating. Then, my father turned to me. This was his pained, difficult confession. He couldn't bring himself to apologize, not directly. Pride was too deeply embedded in his bones. Instead, he said, his eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder, Amara, your husband, he is a very impressive man. It was the closest he could come to admitting his own catastrophic misjudgment. He was acknowledging my worth by acknowledging David's. I didn't have to forgive him. I just listened, my expression impassive, observing the collapse of the patriarch. It was his reckoning, and I was its silent, impassive witness. In the days that followed, the small alignments began. They were more meaningful than any grand statement. An old professor sent me an email. Amara, I have just read about the Terraform Fund. I always knew your vision for AgriGen was revolutionary. Call me. A former investor who had pulled his funding sent a bottle of champagne to my new office with a simple, handwritten note, my deepest regrets and warmest congratulations. These were the quiet apologies, the nods from the sidelines that signaled a permanent shift in the social structure. I was no longer a cautionary tale. I was a case study in resilience, the ultimate external validation, the moment that confirmed my victory had taken root beyond the initial confrontation, arrived a month later. It was a physical object, the cover of African Business Quarterly. David and I were on it, standing in one of the high-tech greenhouses on the farm. We looked like what we were, partners, equals. The headline was stark and powerful. The new power couple, how Terraform's David Alabi and Amara Adebayo Alabi are seeding Africa's tech revolution. I remember holding the magazine in my hands, the paper glossy and cool beneath my fingertips. I stared at my own face, at the look of calm resolve in my eyes. The woman on that cover was not the ghost who had arrived at the farm months earlier. She was the architect of her own second act. That night, as I sat on the veranda of the farmhouse, a place that was no longer a prison but a laboratory, I felt the first real moment of peace. The echoes of the truth had settled, and in the quiet, I could finally hear my own voice again. It was somber validation, a peace hard-won, and it was infinitely more satisfying than triumph. Peace is not an endpoint, it's a process. In the year that followed the reckoning, I began the quiet, deliberate work of claiming my own space, both externally and internally. My new reality was built not on the shifting sands of my father's approval, but on the solid bedrock of my own competence. My life was no longer in the shadow of my family. I returned to myself in a gleaming new office in a high-rise in Ikoyi, the nerve center of the Terraform Fund for African Innovation. The space was a reflection of me, minimalist, efficient, with clean lines and vast windows that overlooked the very city that had cast me out. The air smelled of coffee and possibility. This physical act of returning to Lagos, not as Chief Adebayo's daughter, but as a principal in my own right, was a crucial part of my internal reordering. I spent my days doing what I was born to do, analyzing data, identifying talent, and building the future. My true legacy, I discovered, was not in avenging my past, but in creating a better future for others. This became my quiet act of generosity, the counter-narrative to my father's selfishness. I made it my mission to seek out innovators who, like me, had been overlooked or dismissed. My first major investment was in a startup founded by a young woman from Kano, whose brilliance was matched only by the number of doors that had been slammed in her face. Her technology used AI to predict crop yields with incredible accuracy. When I told her the fund was backing her, the look of disbelief and gratitude in her eyes was more satisfying than any award or magazine cover. In helping her, I was healing a part of myself. I was showing that my journey beyond my own pain was about lifting others up. The new table I built was not in a fancy restaurant or a lavish home, but in the conference room of our incubator. The first gathering was for our inaugural cohort of startups, a dozen brilliant, hungry entrepreneurs from across the continent. David and I hosted them. The atmosphere was not triumphant, but electric, filled with the crackle of new ideas and the warm, authentic hum of shared purpose. Looking around at their faces, I saw the real fruits of my victory. This was my new family, a community built on merit and mutual respect. The final confrontation, the closure with my father, happened on my own terms. He asked to see me, and I had him come to my office. He walked in, no longer the towering chief, but an old man, humbled by the consequences of his own actions. He looked around at the bustling office, at the young innovators collaborating, at the tangible proof of the world I had built without him. "Amara," he said, his voice quiet, "what you have done here, it is remarkable." He finally looked me in the eye. I was wrong. I was not wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. My fear made me a fool. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I didn't feel a surge of anger or even a rush of forgiveness. I felt a distant pity. I understood that his obsession with honor and his fear of shame were a prison of his own making, and he had finally realized he was the sole inmate. Forgiveness isn't something you give to someone else. It's the peace you claim for yourself when they no longer have power over you. I accepted his apology, not for him, but for me. It was the closing of a chapter. The final scene of my story is not one of confrontation or even of gathering. It is a moment of quiet reflection. I am alone in my office late one night, long after everyone else has gone home. The city lights of Lagos glitter below me like a carpet of scattered jewels. On my desk is a photograph of me and David, taken on the farm, his arm around my shoulder, both of us laughing. A partnership forged in the ashes of my old life. I think back on the journey, on the girl who was driven out of this city in a cloud of shame and dust. I think about the woman who returned and remade the city in her own image. If there's one thing I learned, it's that the narratives others write for you are cages, no matter how gilded. The only story that matters is the one you write for yourself. My honor was never his to save. I had to build it myself.